Thank you. On behalf of ZionsBank, let me welcome you all out to another in our series of our wealth management speaker series. Today we're featuring the esteemed author Mitch Albom. I appreciate you coming, I appreciate your business, and I think you'll really enjoy the presentation this morning. While you eat your breakfast, we'll first hear briefly from David Hemingway. David's an executive vice president of ZionsBank Corporation and ZionsBank. He oversees our investment division and our asset and liability management activities, and he's probably one of the most creative minds in the banking industry today. And then we'll hear from the president of our affiliate, the Western National Trust Company. He has a few remarks for us, Kevin Mikan. He's a recognized expert in financial planning and trust management, so we appreciate Kevin. On your table, you'll see a couple of brochures that talk about our wealth management services. We take a holistic approach to this process, and this brochure goes through the products and services that we offer, and it also talks about our wealth management center downstairs in the lobby of this building. If you haven't been there, I encourage you to stop by as you leave this morning. I think you'll be impressed with what you see there. But David and Kevin are key executives in providing the vision for our wealth management services and in designing the products and services that we provide. So David, I'll turn the time over to you.
Thank you, Scott. Again, we're happy to have you here, and hope you enjoy breakfast. And we're happy to have this beautiful location to invite you down to our home. So I just want to take a couple of minutes, and hopefully you recognize what's up here, because I know you can't see it. But from a distance, you should be able to recognize. And basically, this is the same information that's downstairs on the TV wall in the Wealth Management Center, and I'm going to take just a minute and go over it. But if you've been to our new Bountiful branch, it's there. If in a little while you go to our St. George branch, we'll have the same information there, and we're in the process of putting this information into each of our branches. So let me, and again, I realize it's too small for you to see, but it's larger downstairs. Or you can just go to our internet site, zionsdirect.com, and there you can actually see the same information. Let me just stand by this and describe what it is we're looking at here for a minute. As you can see up here at the top, it says recent FDIC-insured CD auctions. And then it just switched there, and now it's gone, and you can see across the top here, we've got actually, this is like Tetris, for those of you that play Tetris. It tells you what's coming up next. I mean, I've always, my son's actually a video game designer, and I've told him the ultimate video game is actually online investing. So we provide, some people just sell investments. We actually provide entertainment with our investments. So what you have across the top here on the Tetris scale is it says you're going to see corporate bond auctions, then you're going to see, I can't actually read it, municipal bonds, and then FDIC-insured CDs, or let's see, the bond store. The bond store, and then FDIC-insured CDs. And so it's going to rotate through. And I'll just take a minute and explain to you what you're looking at. Now here we have live municipal bond auctions. And so these are auctions that says current market yield. That, in fact, is what the market's clearing at. And over on the side here, it tells you how much longer the auction has to go. I mean, this is like eBay. Have any of you ever been to eBay? Well, we've got to get you guys out more. But this is fun. Some people some people actually want to get higher yields. And so now it's just switched, and here's the recent municipal bond auctions. And these are, in fact, the yields that people actually purchased the bonds to yield. And you've got this over here. Now it just switched again, and here we have FDIC-insured CDs at the bond store. And you'd probably say, if you look at this, why is ZionsBank telling me what yields are at other banks, what they could get at a CD at another bank? Let me tell you why this is important. These are not auctions. These are CDs that we're offering of other banks at Zions Direct that you can buy. We have a customer in Park City, has $20 million in his Zions Direct account, and 100% of his money is FDIC insured. So if you're a conservative investor and you say, gee, I'd like to have 100% of my investments FDIC insured, you know, I remember when I first started in banking and we had all the banks on Main Street, and there were a lot of people that came down once a week and walked around, you know, to roll over their CDs, or once every 3 months or whatever. You don't have to do that anymore. You can do it from your bedroom. You know, you can do it on the phone. You can do it in your Zions Direct account. So we're here to help you have more of your money FDIC insured, and we're here to tell you what the best yield is, and we will help you get that. I mean, at the end of the day, what we want is happy customers. That's what Scott tells me he wants. We do not want any unhappy investors. We want happy customers. Because if you're happy, if we provide you with the best service possible, then you will do your banking business with Zions, and we'll be happy too. So what we have again here is we have corporate bond auctions, and these are short-term. Now you'll say, well, gee, there's a General Electric bond, or let's see, there's a Morgan Stanley bond, or there's a JP Morgan bond right there. Well, you say those are not FDIC insured. You're right. Remember that. The corporate bonds are not FDIC insured. Do you really think that JP Morgan's going broke in the next 6 months? If you do, don't buy the bonds. I mean, there's a difference between buying short-term bonds and buying 20-year bonds. What we're showing you is short-term bonds because that's what the customers want. People that are managing their own money are not going long-term. They're going short-term. People that are having other people manage their money, in many cases, are going long-term, and when interest rates go up, they're going to lose money. We also have municipal bonds, and you can see there. Just conclude on that. We have a lot of Utah bonds there. I saw some Salt Lake City bonds up there. Basically, it's tax-free income for both the state of Utah and also for federal income tax. If you're interested in tax-free income, we've got those bonds too. So enjoy your breakfast. We're happy to have you here. And next time you pass the wall downstairs, hopefully you'll know what to look for. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Kevin Mikan, and I'm responsible for trust here at the bank and planning as well. And firstly, you know, I want to thank Scott for creating an organization that puts you, our friends, and our customers first. It's actually his support and his commitment that brings us together today for one of our Zions Premier Wealth Management events. As I regularly do, I was meeting with a Zions customer yesterday. The meeting took place down in St. George. St. George was selected for a couple of reasons, including the fact that that's where this customer's CPA is. But the main reason that we selected St. George was because they were on a long trip. They were working their way down in their motorhome. Perhaps you've passed them on the road in the giant motorhome towing the truck. They were working their way down from Montana to Scottsdale. St. George fit into their trip plan. So putting together a meeting like this, for this to take place, we had to do a lot of planning. We had to coordinate their schedule. We had to coordinate them picking up their dogs at the ranch that they left them at. We had to coordinate the banker that was there at the meeting, getting myself down to St. George. So we had to plan to have a planning meeting. When I sit down with folks, I ask them questions about themselves. I share a bit of my story. I ask them about their story, about their business, about their family, about what keeps them up at night. I do this really because each of us is a story. We each have our own stories. I do this because before I can help them with their story, I need to understand what it is. I need to understand who they are. We each try to write our own stories. However, our stories are impacted and influenced by the stories of others. In Mitch's book, The 5 People You Meet in Heaven, we meet the main character, Eddie. Eddie, like all of us, had his dreams and made plans to create his story. I think in youth we don't realize how much of the writing of our story is impacted by the stories of others. In the book, Eddie really learns this in heaven when he encounters 5 people who impacted his life. In the world of financial and estate planning, it is essential for you to understand and face the realities of your story so that we can help you with the next chapter. In my business of planning, I talk about 2 types of planning. The first is planning for things that may go wrong. You buy homeowners insurance in case your house catches on fire. Now, the likelihood of any one of our houses catching on fire is pretty small, but we plan for that. If you have partners in your business, you have buy-sell agreements in case one of your partners dies or is disabled. Again, the odds of that happening to you are actually statistically very small, but we plan for that. This is important, but the most important planning that we do is the second type, and it's the type I like best. This is planning to increase the odds of things going right. Estate planning so that your hard work benefits those you want it to, while allowing those who benefit to be productive in writing their story. Investment planning that can make sure assets are available to educate kids or grandkids, or to expand a business, or to retire in a lifestyle that you desire. In planning to make things go right, things beyond your control will happen and your story will change. This is why planning doesn't stop. It is an ongoing process that helps you write the next chapter of your story. Zions Premier Wealth Management was created to help you write your story. My colleagues and I at Zions work with you to help bring about the futures that you want, both for yourself and your children and grandchildren. If you are a business owner, we specialize in integrating your business's future with yours as well. Through our wealth management offering, we have the expertise to listen to you, understand your objectives, and offer solutions to bring to reality the futures that you want. I invite all of you to visit the Zions Premier Wealth Management Center on the first floor, and let's share our stories. Hopefully we can be among those who help you write yours. Thank you.
Well, I have the honor of introducing to you Mr. Mitch Albom. Many of you have read his books. Many of us have watched the movies or plays made from his writings. Many have watched him each Sunday morning as a panelist on ESPN's Sports Reporters or enjoyed his sports column. But all of us have been influenced and changed and inspired by his words, which highlight the essence and the roots of human relations. Mr. Albom is a Renaissance man of the first order. In addition to being a writer and sports commentator, he has worked as a stand-up comic, an amateur boxer, a nightclub pianist. He's an accomplished songwriter and lyricist, writing for rock greats like David Crosby. He wrote the song Cooking for Two for the television movie Christmas in Connecticut. He's the author of 10 books, including his newest one that we have on the table for you today, Have a Little Faith. This book started out at the #1 slot on the New York bestseller list. And his book, Tuesdays with Morrie, spent 4 straight years atop the New York Times bestseller list, and is now the best-selling memoir in the world, having sold almost 16 million copies. It's been made into an ABC movie by Oprah Winfrey, and when it debuted in December of 1999, it was the most viewed television movie that year. It's also been made into a play, and some of you have seen that play when it was presented last year by the Shakespeare Festival in Cedar City. He's won more than 100 writing awards from AP, UPI, Headliners Club, National Sports Writers and Broadcasters Association, and others. He's been named the best sports columnist in the nation for a record 13 times, which is the highest honor in his field bestowed by the Associated Press Sports Editors of America. And recently, he was awarded the Red Smith Award for Lifetime Achievement. He's founded 4 charities, including the very first 24-hour medical clinic for homeless children in America, the Dream Fund to help disadvantaged children get involved in the arts, the Time to Help Foundation, which focuses on various projects in Detroit by gathering volunteers on a monthly basis for work projects such as staffing shelters, building homes, and delivering food to the elderly, and the Super All Year, or SAY charity, that aids the homeless in Detroit. Mitch, we're happy to have you with us. As an almost Utah homeowner, we still want to claim you as an adopted son, and we look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you so much. I was hoping you didn't actually remember that, but I was here not too long ago speaking to the League of Cities, and I told a story about how I had come here looking for my first vacation home when I finally earned enough money to, to have some. Because when you live in Detroit, one of your big goals is to try to find a vacation home anywhere. I came to St. George, the St. George area. This was like 10 years ago, 12 years ago. There was nothing really down there. And it was beautiful, and I ended up putting a deposit down on a nice, beautiful plot of land. And what happened is, as I told that story over time, I kept coming back to look at it and look at it and look at it. One time I came back and I went to look at it, and they told me that it had been sold to somebody else. Only I had a deposit on it, and it turned into a whole thing. And it turned out was one of the real estate agents had just sort of taken it for himself and gone off and bought it himself and then sold it a bunch of times. However, so I didn't become a Utah resident. However, I thought when I flew in here last night, I said, there was another near miss. And I just remembered this. So I had a second opportunity to become is it a Utahan? A Utahan? Utahan? Okay. This was before that. And I just remembered this. This is probably, I want to say this was about almost 20 years ago. My father was working out in Spanish Fork, Utah. I don't know if that's near here or anything, but he was out there, and I came to come visit him. It was my first time ever in the state of Utah. Never been here before. And he said, come visit. He was staying out there for a month working. So I came, and he said, and I always in my life had wanted to own something in the mountains. Because when you grow up, I grew up in New Jersey, and then Detroit, everything's so flat, So to see these kinds of things like you see out your window is a huge thrill. So while we were there, we had this spare day, and he said, well, someone told me about this place that they're starting up, and it's up in the mountains, and why don't we take a ride up there, and we'll go look at it. So we got up in the morning, we took a ride up there. This place was called Sundance. Never heard of it before. We drive up, it is the foggiest day in the history of the universe, all right? And we go up there, you can't see anything. And they're just starting to build these little places in some place called Sundance. And we had a guide who took us around and took us to a condo unit. It was like a 1 or 2 bedroom thing, and it had a balcony. And it was a very nice unit, but I wanted the mountains. And she said, well, come out here. We walked out to the balcony. She said, the mountains are right in front of you. I could not see anything but fog. I said, I don't see any mountains. She said, trust me, they're there. They're beautiful. This is like one of the best views you could have. I said, I don't see any mountains. I left, and my father said, what do you think? I said, well, it would be great if you could see the mountains, but I can't see. How am I going to buy something in the mountains? The price, as I recall, was about $85,000. And I said, I'm not going to pay that kind of money, and I can't even see the mountains. So I left, and I went home the next day. I shudder to think what that is worth right now. Somebody could probably tell me that one of the original condos looking out right on top of the mountains is worth in Sundance. Something tells me it's probably a little north of $85,000. But you see, when you can't see the mountains, when you don't have proof, so I missed that was my first opportunity, my second opportunity. So I think I'm destined to just be a visitor to Utah, which is fine. And I thank you for asking me to come. I'm very honored not only to speak here at ZionsBank, but also tomorrow I'm getting an opportunity to do a commencement speech. And that's a big thrill for me. I like talking to young people. There'll be no moment here where I sort of reach into my pocket and take out 3x5 cards or a PowerPoint or anything like that. I speak from the heart and from the head, and actually this goes back to the first time I ever spoke, which was a breakfast meeting, which always makes me nervous because here I am again, because it kind of scarred me for my entire life. I was a young sports columnist in South Florida and had never been asked to speak to anybody for any reason whatsoever. And I got asked to speak to a lodge. It was like an elk or a moose or something. It was some kind of big animal, some big animal lodge. And having never been asked to speak before, I did what probably many of you would have done. I typed up a speech, right? And as you know, South Florida has a pretty good elderly population. And I arrived for this breakfast meeting at this lodge and walked in and was the youngest person in that room by about 97 years. And I proceeded to do what they tell you to never do in Speaking 101. I read my speech with my head down the entire time. And when I finished, I looked up to a room that was about half the size as it had been when I walked in. And it was just a sea of blank expressions. And I said, well, that's it. Are there any questions? Nothing. Are there any comments? Nothing. So I sat down to, one of those things, and they were taking the plates away, just as they're doing right now. And I was feeling like a total failure, and this one older gentleman came up to me, and he put his arm around me. He said, can I ask you a question? So I was happy to have anybody talking to me. And I said, sure. He said, are you going to eat that Danish? And now here I am with Danishes on the table. So that taught me the lesson to never prepare speeches. But actually, the reason that I don't need anything in front of me is that this story that I want to share with you is in my heart and head forever. I hope I never need any prompting to remember it. I will use some of this PowerPoint thing. You'll bear with me because I'm not very good at this kind of thing, but I think the pictures help illustrate it. Often I have someone comes with me and does this, and I have the luxury of not having to worry about pressing buttons, but today I'm going to, so stay with me. I'm going to start actually with something that I heard in a sermon a number of years ago. There's this country preacher who decides one Sunday that he's going to put the fear of God into his congregation with this sermon. And so he comes out that Sunday, and he begins by saying, remember, everyone in this parish is going to die someday. And he notices this one guy in the front is kind of smiling. So he looks at me and says, what are you so happy about? And the guy says, I'm not from this parish. I'm just visiting my sister. Well, when it comes to faith, that little anecdote would actually have been a pretty fair description of me about 10 or 11 years ago. I could have said, I'm not from here. I'm not too worried about things. I'm not concerned about the consequences. It wasn't that I hadn't been raised with faith, probably like most or many of you. I had been indoctrinated in faith when I was a young kid. I was taken to religious school and dragged around by my parents. In fact, I even went to a religious high school from the time I was about 11 years old all the way on through until I graduated. Half the day was religious studies and the other half was secular. And then when I went into college and got out into the world, I pretty much walked away from all of it. Wasn't some tragic loss of faith. It wasn't some terrible thing that made me lose belief in God. It was, if I'm being honest, apathy. It was apathy. I was doing okay. I was busy, like many of you, I'm sure. I had other things going. Life was all right. I was too young to know anybody sick or unhealthy. I was making money. I was doing great. And so I just kind of figured, well, I'll go my way, and God will go his way, and we'll be fine. And as a result, two very interesting things, coincidences, happened. Number one, I never bothered, no matter where I moved or settled in my professional journey, to join another temple wherever I was, because what was the point? I knew I wasn't going to go. And so I just kept up my loose membership where I had grown up in a small town in New Jersey, where I would go back once a year. And as a result of that, I had one clergyman my entire life. He was there when my family joined this temple when I was 6 months old. He was there through my childhood. He was there through my teenage years. He was there through my adult years. He was there whenever I went back once a year to go sort of do my duty. And he was there 10 years ago when I went back to the small town where I grew up and gave a little speech about the book Tuesdays with Morrie. And afterwards, in the hallway of that lecture, he asked me a question that would change my life. He was 82 years old. His name was Rabbi Albert Lewis. He walked up to me using a cane, and this was the question he asked me in the hallway. Will you do my eulogy? To which I said, huh? Will you do my eulogy? In the beginning, that was the question. Now, I don't know about you, but will you do my eulogy to me is pretty much like a doctor handing me a scalpel and saying, will you take out the kidneys? You know, I was totally unqualified. I just got done saying I hadn't been very religious. And besides, who was I to do a eulogy for the guy who does eulogies? You know, I mean, that's his job, right? Personally, I always thought rabbis and priests and pastors had this stuff all worked out with one another ahead of time. You know, I go first, you do me, you go first, I'll do you. Professional courtesy. So how I got into this mix was beyond me, but, you know, when you have your cleric, your man of God, you don't want to say no. And so all I could think of to say was, well, if you want me to speak when you die, I kind of need to know how you lived. I mean, it's true, I guess I have known you my entire life, but it's always been from the seats, and not even the good seats, the cheap seats in the back, you know. If you want me to give your eulogy, then I need to know how you lived as a man. To which he said, I accept. Now, I don't know how well you know your priests, your pastors, your rabbis, your imams, but ask yourself this question. Have you ever gone over their house for dinner? Have you ever driven in the front seat of a car with them? Have you ever seen them in anything other than a suit or a robe? Well, in my case, the answer with Albert Lewis was not only no to all of those things, but when I was a kid, I was so terrified of this man that I literally would run in the opposite direction if I saw him coming. If he was at one end of the hall, I'd turn around, run out the other end of the hall. If I heard his voice coming around the corner, I would hide in the mop closet. I knew where the mop closet was, and I would run in there and pull the door closed and hide inside the mop closet until he passed. Why? Well, come on. He was the man of God, right? You know how we are as kids. There's sort of us here and God up there, and then there's these people in the middle, you know, and they have God's phone number, and they can tell on you, you know. And so I was so certain that if he saw me, he would just look at me and go, I know what you did. And even if I hadn't done anything, I would have confessed to it because you're a kid, you know, and it's the man of God. And so I ran. I ran and I ran and I ran. And now here I was in my early 40s, heading in the opposite direction. Now let me tell you about the first meeting we had because it was kind of funny. I drove to his house. I had never done that before. Got out of the car, walked up to his front door, never done that before. Saw the doorbell there, and for some reason, the idea of a doorbell kind of threw me because, I don't know why, but I didn't think that rabbis or priests or pastors had doorbells. I just thought they sensed you coming. But if I was surprised by the doorbell, I was triply surprised by what happened after I rang it, because the door swings open, and there in front of me is a 82-year-old version of a man who I have never seen in anything other than a suit or a robe, now wearing Bermuda shorts, black socks and sandals, a plaid shirt, and a vest. It looked like he had fallen asleep in a rummage sale and had just woken up with whatever was on top of him. He beckoned me inside, we walked down the hall, and then he did something that I probably should have suspected he was going to do, because anyone who knew Albert Lewis during the course of his life knew that he was a joyous man. He was kind of impish and funny, and he always had a twinkle in his eye, and he loved to sing. Sing anything. He would sing the phone book if given the opportunity. And so when I asked him, "So how are you doing?" instead of getting the standard response, "I'm fine," or "I'm doing okay," his answer was, "The old gray rabbi ain't what he used to be, ain't what he used to be." Like that. He would pick your name out and he would assign a song to it, and that's who you would be your whole life, that song. And lucky me, I got Hello Dolly for some reason. And so my whole life, including when I went to visit him, it was always, "Hello, Mitchell. Well, hello, Mitchell. It's so nice to have you." And not just one line, but the whole song. So you'd have to stand there with that stupid look on your face like, "Please stop. You're really embarrassing me." But that was who he was. He was this joyous guy, and he was, I guess, to be honest, that was one of the reasons that I never bothered or a hurry to join some other temple or synagogue, because I liked going back once a year and hearing him do his sermons. He didn't do the conventional route. Of course, he cited the Bible and all the rest of it, but he would always do things a little bit differently. He would sometimes read Saturday Evening Post stories or Peanuts cartoons or something he found in a magazine. One time he came in, I remember, with a squash and a piece of wood. And he put the squash on the pulpit here and the piece of wood on the pulpit here. And then he took out a hammer and he banged on the squash and it split into a zillion pieces. And then he took out the hammer and he banged on the wood and nothing happened. And he banged on the wood and nothing happened. And then he used this to launch into a sermon about how things that come up quickly and fast are often more easily destroyed than that which takes a long time to grow, like wood or tradition, which of course he also sang, tradition, tradition. So anyhow, we come into his house. I've never been in there before. We walk down to his study. I've never been in this before. We walk into the room. It's a mess. There's letters everywhere, papers everywhere, books, 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 everywhere you look. And then along the top, there are all these files. And I'm looking around at file after file after file with all these labels. And right in the middle of the top shelf, a big, fat file. And right across the front, it says, God. He had a file on God. Who gets to keep a file on God? And what would be in it, Well, didn't have the nerve to ask him that question then, but I wanted to be very professional about this eulogy thing. I wanted to take it very seriously. So I took out a yellow pad, and I took out a pencil, and I sat across from him. And the first question I decided to ask this man of faith who had been in the business for 60-some years was, "Do you believe in God?" "Yes, I do," he said. Believes in God. Okay, write that down. Do you ever speak to God? "I speak to God all the time," he said. "Well, what do you say to God?" I asked. And he sang his answer. He said, "These days I say, dear Lord, if you're going to take me already. And if you're going to leave me here, leave me with enough strength that I can help the people." "Do you get an answer?" I asked. He looked at me and smiled. "Still waiting," he said. Now, while I was growing up there in that little town in New Jersey, a couple hours north, at the exact same time, another kid was growing up in Brooklyn, New York. He too would one day grapple with his faith. He too was dragged to religious school when he was a kid, but that was pretty much where the similarities ended between us. His name was Henry Covington. He was one of 7 African-American children born to a man who worked as a hustler and a woman who worked as a maid. And when Henry was 5 years old, his mother suspected his father of cheating on him. And so she came after him with a shotgun, chased him out of the house, fired at him, missed him, but hit a neighbor, and was taken away to a federal penitentiary. And from that point on, young Henry, from age 5, would visit his mother on weekends and speak to her through glass. The family was so poor that all 7 kids slept in one room in an apartment. And at night, they would put big bowls of rice out on the kitchen counter so that the rats that came in through the walls would dive into the rice and not come into the room. Young Henry spent his entire childhood afraid of falling asleep, lest he be bitten by a rodent. When he was in 6th grade, he got thrown out of school for fighting. A year later, his father passed away, leaving him really with no guidance. Not surprisingly, he became a petty thief and then a bigger criminal, and at 15 and 16 and 17 fell into even more crime. And by the time he was 19 years old, he was heavily into crime on the street, made a lot of enemies, and one of them fingered him in the murder of a police officer. And even though he wasn't there, even though he had nothing to do with it, by the time the lawyers pointed back and forth, they advised him he should plead guilty to manslaughter, lest he be found guilty of murder and be sent away for 25 years to life. And so for a crime he did not actually commit, Henry Covington pleaded guilty and was sent away to prison for 7 years for manslaughter. And as they took him away in handcuffs, he swore that life would owe him when he got out. He didn't think of all the crimes he had committed that he hadn't been punished for. Well, when Henry got out of prison, he began to make good on that promise. He got into the drug business, and the drug business in the 70s and 80s in New York City was thriving. And very quickly he rose up. He began to sell to people on the street, and then more respectable people, and then lawyers and bankers, and even sometimes off-duty police officers. And at one point he made over $500,000 a year in the drug trade, selling heroin, crack cocaine. He got fancy clothes, he got a place to live, he got fancy cars. And then Henry Covington made a fatal error. He tried some of his own product. And pretty soon he was as desperate and as hungry a junkie as any of the people he had sold to. And he began to do anything to just keep his hands on drugs. And so he shot himself in his own leg so he could tell his drug dealers that he had been attacked, so he could keep the drugs that he had gotten from them. He robbed people on the street, just jumped out in front of them, waved a gun in front of their faces, said, "You know what this is," took whatever money they had, ran off, raced off, and bought drugs. One night he did this to an elderly couple, waved a gun in front of their faces, said, "Give me everything you got," took everything you got, jumped in a car, cops were after him. He threw everything out the car window, including the gun, was pulled into the police station, figured, well, they don't have anything on me, I'm safe. And then in walked the elderly couple. And Henry's heart sunk because he realized all they had to do was identify him, and he'd be going back to prison for at least 15 years. And the cop brought the old man over, and he said to him, "Is this the guy who robbed you?" And Henry looked at the old man and lowered his head. And the old man said, "I can't be sure." And the cop said, "What? What do you mean? We just picked him up 5 minutes ago. This is the guy who robbed you, right?" "I can't be sure," the old man said. "I don't want to send an innocent man to jail." Well, Henry was set free that night. And he went home, and he told himself that God had done that. God had wanted him spared. And he went to sleep with that thought. But when he woke up, the thought was gone. And he went back to his ways, and he lost everything he had. Every dollar, home, suit. And finally, when he was 30 years old, he was so broke, so desperate, and so addicted that the only people he could think of to rob who had either money or drugs were his own drug dealers. And this is never a good idea. He went to their apartment with a gun that didn't even have a firing pin in it. He was so whacked out. Banged on the door. They opened the door. He started waving the gun. He said, "You know what this is. You know what this is." They looked at him as if he were crazy. "You don't want to do this," they said. "You know what this is. You know what this is." Well, they gave him some drugs. He raced home, got high, smoked and snorted and sniffed, and smoked and snorted and sniffed. And then right in the middle of it, he had a thought that he probably should have had a few hours earlier. Uh-oh, they know where I live. Well, he ran outside of his place with a shotgun. He told his wife and young baby, "Hide, stay away from the windows, get down, shut off all the lights." He lay on the ground, put a row of trash cans in front of him. And lying on the ground in the street in New York City in the middle of the night, waiting for a car to come around the street, certain that the next set of headlights that came around the corner would be his killer, certain that the next car that came down would mow him down and his family down, and this would be the end of his life. On the ground, holding that shotgun in that moment, he did what many people do at moments like that. Jesus, get me out of this. If you save me tonight, you can have me tomorrow. Just get me through this, and I'm yours. Help me, Lord. Spare me, Lord. Save me, Lord. Let's leave that story there for a moment. Return to my visits with Albert Lewis, whose nickname I always had was the Reb. I don't know, it was a superhero thing, I guess. The Hulk, the Thing, the Reb, you know. Now, one visit had led to two, two had led to three, three had led to four. Usually, when someone asks for a eulogy, you kind of figure time is short, right? But after 4 years of visiting, I was beginning to think that this whole thing was just a clever ruse to draw me back into an adult education class. I had long since gathered enough information to do a basic eulogy. I had all the stuff that you need, but I kept visiting. I kept going back. Why? I don't know. It was affecting me. It was bringing me back to who I had been many, many years earlier. And I was learning a lot about someone who I thought I knew something about, except I was getting to see a man of faith away from the pulpit, away from, you know, the services, seeing him on Mondays and Wednesdays and at work and away from home. And I found out things that I never knew. For example, I found out that he had lost a child. I didn't know this. It had happened before I was born. A little baby girl, 4 years old. She was fine one night, and then all of a sudden she couldn't breathe. They raced her to the hospital. They rushed her into the emergency room. It was an asthma attack. Today, not that big a deal, but in 1959, they rushed her in, and a couple hours later, doctors came out and said, "We're sorry, we couldn't save her. We're sorry, we couldn't save her." And I found out that the Reb had howled at God when that happened. How could this happen to me? How could you let this happen? Aren't I doing enough? Aren't I living a good enough life for you? What about her? She was only 4 years old. And I asked him, didn't that make you question your belief in God? And he said quite the opposite. It was because I had something to go to cry to ask why to, that I was ultimately able to heal. Far better, he said, to believe that there's something there that for whatever reason couldn't answer that prayer than to think that nobody's listening to you at all. Marriage, we spoke about marriage many times. He had been married to the same woman for over 60 years. And I asked him, well, why is it so you're able to be so successful? How come everybody else's marriages are always breaking up and divorces, 50% of marriages break up? He said, well, I think young people today expect too much out of marriage. They want everything to be Romeo and Juliet all day long. Better they should do what my wife does. I said, what does your wife do? He said, well, whenever we go out and people ask, what's the secret to a good marriage? She always says, it's true. Albert and I have had 30 wonderful years together. And everyone nods and smiles, and then they do the math. Wait a minute. You've been married a lot longer than that. That's right, she said. On Monday, you get a good 5 hours. On Tuesday, a good 45 minutes. On Wednesday, a good 20 minutes. You add it all up, it's a great 30 years. Probably better than Romeo and Juliet. Happiness. We talked about happiness of all subjects, such a big subject. What makes people happy? And we had this discussion in a most unusual place. It was in a hospital. He had been admitted for a small stroke, and I went in to go see him. And by the way, if you've never seen your priest or rabbi or pastor in a medical gown that keeps falling open, you haven't lived. And so we were talking about happiness and what makes a person really happy. And out in the hallway, a baby was crying. And he stopped and he said, do you hear that baby? And I said, yeah. He said, well, did you ever notice how when infants, they come into the world, their little fists are clenched like this. I said, yeah. He said, that's because babies don't know any better. And they come into the world thinking they're going to take everything. He said, but look at me. I'm an old man, and I'm going to die soon. And how am I going to die? And he said, that's because when we get to the end, we realize we're not taking anything with us. So we sat there for a minute quietly, and then to break the silence, I said, so have we solved the secret of happiness? Yes, we have, he said. Are you going to tell me? Yes, I will. Are you ready? Am I ready for the secret of happiness? Yes, I am definitely ready. You can go anytime you want. Be satisfied. That's it, I said. Be grateful. That's it. For all you have, for all God has given you, and for all the love you receive. That's it, I said. That's it, he said. And in all the days and weeks and months that have passed since then, I've never actually been able to crack a hole in that particular theory of happiness. Be satisfied, be grateful for all you have, the love you receive, and what God has given you. Well, let me shift the story here now to Detroit, where I live. Detroit is a very beleaguered city, as you probably know. It doesn't look like this when you look out the window. We have 24% unemployment, over 100,000 abandoned buildings. Our homeless problem is so acute, so bad that you can almost go nowhere without running into someone who's on the street. And partly as a result of my visits with the Reb, I started a charity to help the homeless. And it grew very quickly because of the need. And pretty soon we were funding pretty much every homeless shelter in Detroit in some way. And part of my responsibility was to go around and find places that needed help. And I heard about this one unusual shelter that was being run out of a church. But it wasn't just any church. This church was once the largest Presbyterian church in the entire Midwest. It had 50 Sunday school teachers on its roster, 2,000 families. But that was in 1880 when it was built. Today, it was left alone in one of the worst sections of Detroit, decayed and rotting. Its roof crumbling, its walls crumbling, its stained glass windows falling apart. And there was a giant hole in the roof of this church through which rain and snow literally fell in on top of the congregation. It was more than 20 feet long. It had been there for 10 years. And literally, if you were sitting in the pews, you would get snowed on or rained on. And they would have to put trays and buckets all over the place just to try to make something dry in the church. You couldn't heat the church because the heat would go right up through that hole. Wind would blow inside. And in fact, the congregants, many of whom were homeless, at one point were so cold during the winter that they actually built a plastic tent inside their sanctuary made of 2x4s and plasticine so that they could come inside with their coats on and try to pray to God under plastic in a church with a hole in its roof in the 20th century in the United States of America. Hard to believe. Well, I said this is certainly a place that can use some help. So I asked to meet the pastor. And they said, just wait here. And a couple minutes later, around the corner came a very large man. He was well over 400 pounds. He was wearing a white T-shirt. He was carrying a box. He was sweating profusely from his forehead, mopping his brow. I thought he was the janitor. And then he held out his hand. And he said something to me that would also change my life forever. What he said was this: hello, my name is Henry Covington. And this was where Henry Covington had landed 20 years after that night that he had asked Jesus to save him on those streets of New York. No cars came around the corner that night. No bullets were fired. He woke up on the ground with the sun coming up. It was a Sunday morning, Easter Sunday morning. And he walked inside holding the shotgun, put it underneath his bed, looked at his wife who was crying on the bed and said, "Let me ask you a question. What's keeping you from going to God?" And she looked at him through tears and she said, "You are." And he realized this terrible life that he had been leading was not only pulling him down, but pulling down everybody he loved around him. And so he staggered to the bathroom, fell to his knees, asked Jesus for forgiveness. And then he opened the medicine cabinet and drank a bottle of NyQuil and knocked himself out for the day. And when he woke up the next day, he drank another bottle. And the next day did the same, the poor man's detox, until he was finally able to break free from the grip that those drugs had on him. And then, miracle of miracles, he kept his promise. And he actually worked his way back to goodness. And he joined the church, and he got involved, and he went to prisons, and he spoke to prisoners, and eventually he became an elder, and then became a deacon, and then eventually was sent to Detroit to try to find a church to open there. And he found this old building that they were willing to give him if he wanted to try to keep it open and running. And he started something called the I Am My Brother's Keeper Ministries. I Am My Brother's Keeper Ministries. And this was where Henry Covington worked for no salary, taking care of a mostly homeless population in a church with a hole in its roof at the bottom of the world. Now, I have to admit, when I first met Henry, I didn't really trust him. For one thing, within the first 5 minutes, he was telling me he'd been a drug dealer, a drug addict, a thief, incarcerated, manslaughter, and I thought, well, this is all very nice and good that he's being honest, but isn't there some point you get disqualified from the pulpit, you know? Isn't there some minimum test score you have to achieve to get up there? Besides, he was different. He was different than me. And let's be very honest with one another. When it comes to faith, we don't trust different. We might say we do. We might pay it lip service or be politically correct, but deep in our heart, there's ours, there's theirs. There's what we know and what we don't know. The familiar, the different, the ones who got it right, and those poor souls out there who got it wrong. We don't trust different. And I didn't trust Henry because he was different. How different could you get? Here I was, this white kid who'd grown up in the suburbs, and I was used to services that kind of went like this, you know, someone stood up front, everyone was quiet, you know, respectful, they read whatever. That wasn't the way it worked in Henry's church. In Henry's church, pretty much anybody could say anything at any time, and they did. So Henry might be up there talking, and someone would be yelling, hallelujah, or amen, or preach it. Or in the case of this one guy named Virgil, he just liked to pop up every now and then out of a seat and go, well, no particular time or reason. Henry could be saying, let's turn to page 13, and Virgil would go, well. It was different. And we don't trust different. And I probably wouldn't have trusted it either, except that I had been going to see this other clergyman for all those years and realized how wrong I had been about so many assumptions I had about him, and had gotten to know him away from the pulpit. And so I said, well, maybe I should try to do the same with this guy. And so I did. I began to visit him, talk to him on Tuesday nights and Thursday nights, not just on Sundays during services. And we hung around and we spoke and we got to know one another. And what I discovered was somebody amazing. Here was a guy who drove around the poorest neighborhoods in Detroit in an old beat-up black car with food on the hood and the roof of his car that he had gotten from food bags, breads and hams and juices and things. And he would drive 1 mile an hour so it wouldn't fall off. And he would honk his horn until the people who were squatting in all these burned-out buildings would come running outside and literally just get the food. And he would feed them. He would hand them the food. He wouldn't ask for anything in return. He didn't have to join his church. Half the time, he didn't even identify himself. He just said, Jesus loves you. Here, take the food. He fed the hungry. What's more Christian than that? I learned that he took in all kinds of troubled cases, people that you would never probably give the time of day to, including a guy named Cass, who was a heroin addict and a crack addict and homeless. He was missing a leg. He was toothless. And somehow Henry took a liking to him, and he said, Cass, if you need some work, I can help you out. Why don't you help unload the food trucks? And Cass said, yeah, okay, I can do that. Unfortunately, Cass had his own distribution system. It was 1 for the church and 2 for Cass. He would throw these things out in the field, and then he would sell them later for drugs. Henry saw this. He knew it. He could have dismissed him. He could have said, I'm done with you. I gave you a chance. But he didn't. He refused to hold somebody in his past as he had been held in his past. He gave him time. And eventually, over time, somebody broke into Cass's squatted apartment where he was staying, stole the pipes out from under the sink for the copper while he was sleeping. It burst a water main, and Cass woke up face down in water floating out of his apartment. And he came to the pastor the next day. He said, Pastor, I can't work for you today because these are all the clothes I own, and they're all soaked. And Henry said to him, go inside the church. On the second floor, there's clothes hanging from a rack. Take whatever you want. It was the first time in 3 years that Cass had worn clean underwear. He came back out, and Henry said to him, now, where will you live, Cass? Cass said, I ain't got no place to live. And Henry looked at him, and he said, why don't you live with me? And that night, he moved this total stranger, crack addict, could have been anything, could have done anything, into his home, where he lived with his wife and 3 children in a tiny 900-square-foot place. And they all moved upstairs, and Cass slept on the couch downstairs. Not for a night, not for a week or a month, but for a year. A year. And during that year, he turned around. And today, many years later, he's not only clean, sober, has been for years. He's an elder of the church. He married a woman from the church. They have a beautiful little girl named Miracle, who's 9 years old and who runs around the church as if she owns it. All because one man refused to give up on someone else or to hold him in his past or to see him the way that he was. And so one night I went down to that 900-square-foot place where Henry lived. Sat on the couch where Cass had lived. It was a dilapidated place, and I made a bad remark about, I guess a life of crime pays better than a life of God. And he looked at me and he shrugged and he said, Mitch, it doesn't matter. I'm where I'm supposed to be. I said, what do you mean? He said, Mitch, when I was younger, I broke every one of the 10 Commandments. Well, come on, Henry. I said, not every one. Every one. Stealing, coveting, yeah. Adultery, false witness, yeah. Murder. I never pulled the trigger, he said, but I might as well have. People died all around me, and I could have stopped it, and I didn't. And then he said something that I still can't get past. Mitch, I'm probably going to hell. For the things I've done, God will be justified, and God will not be mocked. And I said, but Henry, all the good that you do now. And he shook his head. He said, you can't work your way into heaven, and I'm not trying to. All I'm doing now is to try to make something of my time on earth so that when I stand before God, my record isn't just all the bad stuff that I did. And then, whatever he wants with me, I accept. Well, I shook his hand, and I got up, and I realized I was looking at that rarest of things in life, a changed man. And I went out into the snow, and I drove back home. And that was the last time I ever doubted Henry Covington. So now to the end of this story, my visits with the Reb. I had been visiting for 8 years. I was beginning to think he would do my eulogy. He was 90 years old. 90 years old. It was true. He was in a wheelchair at this point, and his health was failing, but he still had that twinkle in his eye. Still greeted me with that, hello, Mitchell, hello, Mitchell. And on one Sunday, which turned out to be our last Sunday together, we were talking about heaven. And I don't know, I must have had this question and that thing and asked him this and what do you think? And at one point he threw his hands out and he looked up to the sky and he said, Dear Lord, this one has so many questions. Please give him many more years on earth. And that way, when we see each other again, we'll have lots to talk about. And I said, do you really think we're going to see each other again? And he said, don't you? And I said, well, let's face it, I don't think I'm going where you're going. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, come on. I mean, they have to have like a special wing for people like you. You know, you're a man of God. And he looked at me very sweetly. He said, but you're a man of God too. Everyone is. And you could have knocked me over with a feather, because for this pious, righteous 90-year-old man to put himself on the same level as me, where I did not belong, was not only an act of humility, but is what faith is supposed to be about. It's not supposed to be about looking at the guy next to you and saying, I'm more pious than you are. It's not supposed to be looking across the street and saying, I'm more pious than you, my religion's better than yours. It is about looking at the person next to you and saying, you're a child of God too. Everyone is. And if we honestly did that with one another, we would have to treat each other better, because you would see the person next to you as the same as you, and you wouldn't do harm to yourself. You're a child of God too. Everyone is. Well, a couple days later, the Reb started to feel badly. Took him to the hospital. Took him for tests. While he was in the hospital, he was in the hallway in a wheelchair waiting for an x-ray. And an orderly somehow figured out that he was some kind of clergyman and came up to him and said, excuse me, I don't mean to bother you, but I'm having kind of a rough patch in my life right now, and I was sort of wondering if maybe you would give me a blessing. And so there in the hallway of a hospital, my old Reb, one last time, put his hands on the head of a stranger and asked God to bless him. And the next morning, 6 a.m., a nurse came in to help get him ready for a bath. And he was doing what he did best, singing to her, making her laugh, when his head slumped over and his music stopped forever. I like to think that God so enjoyed hearing one of his creatures joyous enough to be singing in a hospital, that he chose that moment to bring him home. Well, in case you're wondering, I did do the eulogy. I had made a promise and I intended to keep it. And so even though it felt very strange, I walked up to that pulpit that day. I stood where he used to stand. I looked out at the congregation that he used to look out on. And towards the end of those remarks, this is what I said. After leading us through 6 different decades, Reb, you finally stepped down from this pulpit. But instead of moving to someplace warm, as many people do, you simply took a seat in the back row of this sanctuary. It was a humble act, but you could no more move to the back row than the soul could move to the back of the body. This is your house, Reb. You're in the rafters, the floorboards, the walls, the lights. You're in every echo through every hallway. How can any of us let you go? You're woven through us from birth to death. You educated us, married us, comforted us. You stood at our mileposts, our weddings, our funerals. You gave us courage when tragedy struck. And when we howled at God, you stirred the embers of our faith and reminded us, as a respected man once said, that the only whole heart is a broken heart. Look at all the broken hearts here today, Rev. Look at all the faces. My whole life I had one clergyman. Your whole life you had one congregation. How do we say goodbye to you without saying goodbye to a piece of ourselves? Where do we look for you now? We look where you have been trying, good sweet man of God, to get us to look all along. We look up. Well, in the weeks and months that followed, I got more involved with the church, and Henry eventually dubbed me the first official Jewish member of the I Am My Brother's Keeper Ministries Church. And eventually, I wrote a book about the experience between these two men that you have on your table. And when the book came out, a funny thing began to happen. Envelopes began to arrive at the church. Letters. Inside would be $5 or $10. And the letters all essentially said the same thing. Fix your roof. I don't have a lot of money, but fix your roof. Church shouldn't have a hole in its roof. Fix your roof. Until enough of these letters came from around the world, literally from around the world, that one Monday, just before Christmas, a big truck pulled up to the corner of that church. And the homeless population and all the congregants and Henry and everyone were waiting on the corner, and they began to unload boxes of shingles and handed them in a human line up a ladder to the roof, and then cheered and sang, "Amen, amen, amen," as men on top of the roof began to fix this hole that had been there for over 10 years. And today, if you go to the I Am My Brother's Keeper Ministry Church, as you are more than welcome to do if you ever stop in Detroit, and you walk inside the church and you stand right where that hole used to be in the sanctuary, and you look up, you will see a plaque in the ceiling with the names of every single individual from around the world who gave even 50 cents to help fix that roof. Because, let's face it, when you're in a church and you look up, you should see something inspiring, right? And what could be more inspiring than proof that people of all races, all religions, all faiths, all nationalities can come together to fix each other's holes when they need to. I never did find out why Albert Lewis asked me to do his eulogy, especially since I always knew deep down he could do it better than I could. When I finished, I sat back down, and his grandson walked up to the pulpit holding a cassette tape. And he put the tape in the player, and he pressed the button. And one last time, a very familiar voice rang out over the speakers. And this is what it said. "Hello, my friends. This is the voice of your past rabbi speaking." He made a tape. Hadn't told anybody. It was very short, maybe 2 minutes. But in it, he answered the two questions he said he'd been asked the most as a man of faith. One was the very first question I asked him: "Do you believe in God?" And he said that he did. The second one was, "What happens when we die?" To this he said, "My friends, the good news is, by the time you hear this, I'll know. The bad news is, now that I know, I can't even tell you. You're gonna have to figure it out for yourselves." I think what he was saying was simple. You have to have a little faith. It is what gets us through the toughest of times. The illnesses, the sadness, the setbacks, the depression. Have a little faith. And perhaps one day we will actually figure it out for ourselves. By the way, I did open that file on God. I went back a few months after the Rebbe had passed away, went to his office, stood on a chair, got the big file down, held it in my arms. I admit I paused for a moment because I was flashing on that Indiana Jones movie where they open the ark, you know, and I didn't want my face to melt off. But when I finally opened that file, and I really wished that the Reb was there with me, and I opened the file, and he was. He was. Because there inside that file were hundreds of pages of anecdotes, stories, biblical quotations, notes written in the Reb's handwriting, all about God. And I realized I was holding in my arms everything he'd ever tried to teach me. It wasn't about having the answer. It was about the search for the answer. You can't fit God in a file. If you could, everyone would have one on his shelf. It's the choosing to believe in those things that don't fit inside a file. It's the choosing to believe in something bigger than yourself. It's the choosing to believe that we're here for a larger purpose than just worm food at the end. It's the choosing to believe that there's something divine inside every one of us in this room and in this town and on this planet that connects all of us. Some spark of humanity, some piece of God that's inside everybody that connects us all, that you can't see and you can't prove, but you just know it's there. It's the choosing to believe that we have a purpose and a reason to trust one another and a reason to work with one another, a reason to try to make the world better. It's the choosing to believe that, not having it laid out in front of you, but choosing to believe that. That is the crazy, maddening, sometimes disappointing, but ultimately, in the end, satisfying journey that we call faith. Faith in God, faith in one another, faith in humanity. In the beginning, there was a question: will you do my eulogy? In the end, that question and all the other questions gets answered. I believe that, like the Reb, God sings, and all of us down here hum along. And there are many melodies, many, many melodies, but it's all one song. One same beautiful human song. Thank you very much for listening to me this morning and inviting me to come talk to you. I enjoyed it.